Welcome to the Bookshop Aberystwyth Arts Centre's eventcast. This is your opportunity to listen again or catch up with our regular Thursday events. This is episode 5. In this episode we welcome Dr. Matthew Jarvis to the bookshop and invited him to give a public lecture as part of the Devolved Voices project. It's a project that is considering the development of English language poetry from Wales since the vote for devolution, with a particular focus on those poets who have emerged since 1997 and a consideration of the rise in poetry from women. The project has been generously funded by the Leatherholme Trust, and for further details you can visit www.aber.ac.uk/devolved voices. The title of this lecture is Family and Community, the Poetry of Jonathan Edwards. We were surprised and honoured to find the poet himself among the audience and invited him to read the 3 poems that form the backbone of Matthew's talk. Jonathan is from Crosskeys, South Wales, and is recently the recipient of the prestigious 2014 Costa Poetry Award for his collection My Family and Other Heroes, published by Seren. But I'll allow Matthew as an introduction to then list the other awards that he has. Dr. Matthew Jarvis is a writer and a critic. His scholarship focuses on English language poetry in Wales since the 1960s and on British avant-garde poetry of the same period. You can find more information at www.matthew-jarvis.co.uk. And Matthew will be introduced by Professor Peter Barry, and Peter is Professor of English at Aberystwyth University and is the Devolved Voices project leader.
My family in a human pyramid. My uncle starts it, kneeling in his garden. My mother gives a leg up to my gran. When it's my turn to climb, I get a grip of my Bamps minus belt, my cousin's heels, say thank you for a birthday card as I go, then bounce on my nan's perm and skip 3 rows, land on my father's shoulders. He grabs my ankles, half holding me up and half holding me close. Here he comes, my godson, Samuel Luke, passed up until he's standing in his nappy on my head. And now to why we're here. Could the Edwardses together reach a height that the youngest one of us could touch a star? Sam reaches out. He points towards the night. And this is the poem about Doc Emmett Brown, the death of Doc Emmett Brown in Back to the Future. I sit here in the darkness with my father, slurping Pepsi, passing popcorn round. The Libyans come fast around the corner, pump Doc Brown with automatic fire. My feet are dangling inches from the ground. I sit here in the darkness with my father as Marty hits 88 miles an hour, goes back to 55 to warn Doc Brown. The Libyans come fast around the corner, pump Doc Brown with automatic fire. He gets up, dusts his bulletproof vest down. I sit here in the darkness with my father, who starts to gently snore. Now time goes quicker. The cinema's knocked down, moved out of town. The Libyans come fast around the corner on DVD. My boy asks for Transformers instead, as from the wall his Bamp looks down. I sit here in the darkness with my father. The Libyans come fast around the corner. And this is the one about the Chartist mural. So this was written when the mural was still there, and I never imagined that it would be knocked down. And now it's not there anymore. And I was showing some Indian poets around Newport this week, and of course the one thing you want to show them is the mural. So you just have to point at this building site where they're building TGI Fridays and say it was there, you know. So this very weird thing, because in your head it's still there, but it's not actually really there. So this is about the Chartist mural. This tunnel is the way from one place to another. Shortcutting from the station, you pass these men, flattened by history to a busker's backdrop, marching for centuries towards a Westgate they will never reach. And, bottom right, these 3, forever dying, are bleeding from their mouths, their hearts, red tiles. This tunnel is the way from one time to another, the school trip boy who stares from morning at the unmoving men, their fault line features and their jigsaw jaws, make sketches in his head he'll never finish. Kingsmen, firing the slowest bullets in the world at those whose screams shatter their faces into pieces. This tunnel traps the wind, makes catwalk models of the men chasing Monday morning through it. Bank workers, weekend deserters with long memories in their laptops. Now this tramp, his duvet growing from his chin, wondering how he got here, wakes face to face with the universal manhood suffrage banner. These bits and pieces, men, look at each other.
Right, good evening everyone. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm Peter Barry, part of the Devolved Voices project, Leverhulme project, which has been running for the past 3 years. And Matt Jarvis, who's going to do the lecture this evening, is the mainstay of Devolved Voices. Another of the mainstays is Catherine Gray, who's based in Cardiff, and Bron, who's here, and myself. It's the four of us. So this is part of the project, and one of the several poets that we've been studying during the project, particularly those who've recently emerged, as we called it, and one of the major emergees is Jonathan Edwards. We're delighted to have him actually present, and Matt is going to lecture on his work, so I won't say anything more about him. Just to introduce Matt briefly, he's become very prominent in Welsh cultural circles over the past decade or so. He's the Anthony Dyson Fellow in Poetry at Lampeter. He's co-chair of the Association for Welsh Writing in English. He's co-editor of the International Journal of Welsh Writing in English. That's its new snappy title. He's research associate for what is usually called CREW at Swansea, the Centre for Research into English Literature and Language of Wales. He's on the Members Committee of the Welsh Academy. He's on the advisory body of the National Library of Wales, and he's associate member of Aberystwyth David Jones Centre. He's also a former winner of the Enwyn Thomas Prize. And just to mention his two main recent books, Welsh Environments in Contemporary Poetry, 2008, and the Ruth Bidgood volume in the Writers of Wales series, which came out in 2012. So that's just a little bit about Matt and his career, and there are hundreds of articles which I'm just mentioning collectively as hundreds of articles. So his title this evening is Family and Community, the Poetry of Jonathan Edwards. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much, Peter. Particular thanks to the Leverhulme Trust, obviously, who gave us just upwards, I think, of £230,000 to spend 3 years looking at Welsh poetry in English since 1997. So, a quick word for our sponsors. Thank you very much to them. Thank you also, Jonathan, for coming along this evening. I hope you don't find it too strange that you're going to be referred to rather po-faced as Edwards throughout this. And, you know, if I get anything horribly wrong, perhaps you could throw up your arm later. Yes, copy of the book. And thank you, Simon, for hosting. There are copies of the book on sale, but there are also lots of copies of other volumes that we've been looking at in the project. So please spend your money. It's a good thing to spend your money on. So my concern in the Devolved Voices project has been to address the work of poets who have emerged at a range of different points during the years since Wales's devolution yes vote of 1997. So most recently, actually, I've been writing about Tiffany Atkinson, whose first collection appeared in 2006, so kind of in the middle.
A little before that, I was writing on the poetry of Nerys Williams, whose first collection came out far more recently. She's one of my recent bunch in 2011. And I've even gone back right into the mists of time to think about Samantha Wynne Ruther, whose first collection came out aeons ago in 2001. So it's wide-ranging, our focus is. But today my focus is on the most recent arrival amongst those poets who I've made the particular focus of my own work for the project. A poet who only saw the publication of his first collection, this, My Family and Other Superheroes, in February 2014. And the poet, of course, is Jonathan Edwards, a writer born and brought up in Crosskeys, in South Wales Valleys. You think South Wales Valleys count, Crosskeys counts as South Wales Valleys? Yes. And who is resident there again and teaches in Monmouth. Like about a quarter, according to Catherine Gray's headcount, like about a quarter of Wales's post-97 English language poets, Jonathan Edwards is a product of the university creative writing system, in part. Let me say that in part. His own qualification being an MA in writing from the University of Warwick. But I think it's important to note that it was a workshop course after leaving university that Jonathan said in his interview for Devolved Voices was responsible for his, and I quote, falling back in love with form and craft. And that workshop was clearly responsible as well for offering practical guidance through the poet David Briggs, who taught the course in question. So a lot of this is dealt with in the Devolved Voices interview that Jonathan did, so if you're interested in that, please follow up video interview on the Devolved Voices website. So as my colleague on the project argues, Jonathan shouldn't be seen as a straightforward product of the contemporary HE creative writing system. His creative pathway has been somewhat more complex than that. By the time of this first collection, Jonathan Edwards had already got a good array of awards behind him. So the back cover blurb to the collection informs us that he won the Terry Hetherington Award in 2010, was awarded a Literature Wales New Writers Bursary in 2011, and in 2012 won prizes in the Cardiff International Poetry Competition and the Basil Bunting Award. That's quoting from Seren's blurb. More recently, in September 14, My Family and Other Superheroes was, as I'm sure everybody knows, shortlisted for the prestigious Fenton Aldborough First Collection Prize, and, more high profile still, you're getting uncomfortable yet.
I'm really happy.
In November 14 was shortlisted for the Costa Poetry Award, an award which the collection subsequently won, which is, I think, a very big deal for English language poetry in Wales as a whole, particularly in terms of its latest generations. It is arguably one of the biggest, most high-profile prizes won by an Anglophone Welsh poet. Most recently still, of course, just at the beginning of May, in fact, and as reflected by these stickers, the book was announced as being on the shortlist of the Book of the Year for Wales Book of the Year for 2015, competing for the Poetry Award with Tiffany Atkinson and Patience Agbabi. So, in short, whether he intends it or not, Jonathan is clearly a poet who's making all the right moves in the context of post-90s UK poetic life, by which I mean accumulating bursaries, qualifications, and high-level awards, indeed very high-level awards in this case, or shortlistings for such awards. The whole economy of awards and reviewing and bursaries is a fascinating subject in its own right, and I think actually Jonathan makes a very interesting case study. Looking at some of the reviews that My Family and Other Superheroes has received is interesting in the sense that what is arguably most striking, I think, are the crossovers that are identifiable between their various assessments. So there's an early review which came on the Welsh Books Council's gwales.com website by someone called Liam Nolan, who I don't know. But he kind of sets the tone when he opens his brief assessment with the observation that, and I quote, "My Family," this is a great quote, "My Family and Other Superheroes is a debut collection so full of warmth, respect and humility that by the end of my first read through, I desperately wanted to buy Jonathan Edwards a pint." The note of warmth is the key one here. That's the one I want to pull out, I think. And it's a quality that I picked out myself in a review for Mike Jenkins's Red Poets magazine. So I suggested that the book's first section is typified by what I called an open-hearted warmth towards its subject matter, and I concluded my comments about the book as a whole by calling it big-hearted. On the website Write Out Loud, a reviewer called Dave Morgan considered a key quality of the book to be what he called its, quote, appeal to emotion, and he noted that the writing, again, quote, relies heavily on pathos, heart firmly on its sleeve. And even Myrian Jordan, who was writing for the online section of the journal Lighthouse, and he was more concerned actually with Edwards's similarities of approach with what he called, I quote here, the sort of vignettes that characterised the earlier work of Northern English poets like Simon Armitage and Andrew Waterhouse a decade or more ago. But although he was mainly interested in that, even Myrian Jordan draws towards his conclusions by making the point, which echoes the other reviews, that Edwards has, and I quote, produced verse of compelling charm and grace. Again, I'm going to carry on piling on the examples for a bit. There's nothing an academic likes more than getting examples in. So the first words of description in Pippa Little's review for Elsewhere, a review of contemporary poetry, indicated that the collection is, two words here, engaging and warm. And I'm going to mispronounce him. João Moraes, in the autumn 2014 edition of New Welsh Review, went so far as to claim that, and again this is a quote, "It is impossible to dislike this collection." This is someone writing a review. Crumbs. It is impossible to dislike this collection. And the reason, he says, is precisely because of the warmth and affection. That's the quote, the warmth and affection that the poetry displays. And the reviewer, Moraes, declares, Edwards has perfected the art of tugging at the heartstrings. These reviews, in other words, point towards a poetry of warmth and graciousness. Keep those two words in the head, I think. Although, let's just add a little extra from Myrian Jordan. Myrian Jordan talked about the work's vivacity. It's what he called its infectious elan. And he said, the implication, I think, is that that should be placed alongside notions of warmth and graciousness. So, I guess what I'm trying to say there is that the review responses to My Family and Other Superheroes should not be taken to imply that the warmth of the collection brings with it some sort of, I'm struggling to know how to say this, but some sort of over-easy coziness. Rather, as Myrian Jordan observes, this is a poetry that is, I quote, lively, engaging and often witty. Or in my own words, it's work that is full of playful confidence. That's how I described it for Red Poets magazine. Or again, in the words of the Costa Prize judges, we haven't had as much fun reading a poetry collection in ages. We haven't had as much fun reading a poetry collection in ages. So in short, what I think the reviews are getting at is warmth and wit, emotional depth and fun, and the poet himself can now sit at the front and crinkle with embarrassment. It's a nice set of reviews, undoubtedly, but I think it is very interesting that there's such important crossovers. Warmth, emotional depth, but also wit and fun. So as João Moraes suggests, perhaps most strongly of all the book's reviewers to date, family is fundamental to Edwards's poetic engagements in this volume. For Moraes, in fact, it's precisely family that is the focus for the definitive warmth and affection. That's his words, warmth and affection, that the collection exudes. In that context, this emphasis on family from that reviewer, it's interesting that Jonathan Edwards himself, in a guest post for the New Welsh Review blog, acknowledges that a number of his poems have what he called an outlandish surface. But he argues that their ultimate concern, irrespective of the outlandish surface, is what he called something real. Something real. A primary part of which, he suggested in that blog piece, is family, his family, and its history. As he puts it, behind any surface dazzle, it is, I quote here, truths about family and place that I'm ultimately interested in getting to. Truths about family and place that I'm ultimately interested in getting to. Now, the book's divided up into 4 sections, if you haven't read it, and if you haven't read it, why not? And concern with family is it's the dominant and entirely overt focus of the first of those 4 sections. And you get it displays that concern with family in the titles of a number of constituent poems there. My Family in a Human Pyramid, Evel Knievel Jumps Over My Family, The Voice in Which My Mother Read to Me, BAMP, which means grandfather, Building My Grandfather, and My Uncle Walks to Work, 1962, just to select some of the titles. But note this, please. At the outset, the vision of family in this opening section is of a quite particular type, and this, I suppose, is where I start to work towards a bit of analysis. What Jonathan Edwards envisages in terms of his poetics of family is crucially an extended social structure. Thus, although the speaker's mother and father, and I will make a distinction between the speaker, please, and the poet. I don't want to assume that the two are the same thing, of course. The speaker's mother and father in the poems are clearly dominant figures in the section's 11 poems, and whilst the speaker's own son also appears in one, the section as a whole also sees the presence of uncle, cousin, godson, grandmother, Nan, grandfather, Bamp, great-uncle, who died in World War I, and even, I realise today, belatedly, great-grandparents. And it's precisely a vision of extended family that begins the section as a whole in the volume's opening piece, My Family in a Human Pyramid. Now, I'm an academic. I've given you a handout. Can't be an academic and not have a handout. I even gave one to Jonathan, though I suspect he doesn't need it. So the narrative premise of this particular poem is based, I think, on one of Edwards' outlandish constructions. The notion of a family, across generations and branches, trying to form a human pyramid in an uncle's garden. And the something real that this improbable idea allows the poem to construct is the sense of a family built together, intertwined in the act of what, for better or worse, I will call a common achievement. The poem is, I think, a partially rhymed sonnet. I mean, it's clearly a sonnet, but I think there's also some partial rhyming there too, with the octet setting up the basic situation with which the poem is concerned. And I'll read it partly because I like it. My uncle starts it, kneeling in his garden. My mother gives a leg up to my gran. When it's my turn to climb, I get a grip of my Bamp's miner's belt, my cousin's heels, say thank you for her birthday card as I go, then bounce on my nan's perm and skip 3 rows, land on my father's shoulders. He grabs my ankles, half holding me up and half holding me close. That's the first part then. I think the structures of familiarity that are established here, by which I mean structures of family, are fairly detailed. Most obviously, and it's so obvious, it's just blindingly obvious, different generations help one another. There are theorists of the family, 2 of which are James M. White and David M. Klein. And their sociological assessments of the family suggest one key notion is that the family is a fundamentally intergenerational social unit. And I think this poem at this point keys into that sense. But the poem also doesn't just do that, it's not just intergenerational, it also figures patterns of reciprocal gratitude as the speaker thanks his cousin for a birthday card. And the poem also shows the speaker's manifest reliance on the achievements or styles of other family members. So from the historic employment of grandfather, figured in that miner's belt there, to the springboard of the grandmother's perm, which I particularly enjoy. Perms do appear elsewhere in the collection too, watch out for the perms. And in the figure of the father, there is both emotional intimacy and resolutely physical support. And I want to suggest that this latter sense of physical support is centrally important to the imaging of family in the poem. Family members, I'm a very literal critic here, so family members literally grip onto and climb on each other in order to achieve their collective aim. With the material life, the material needs of the family, their material mutual intertwining, thus being crucially acknowledged by the poem. So I think it's significant that as the speaker reaches his father, the emotionally resonant half holding me close is what follows on from being physically supported. There's that moment where the speaker's father grabs his ankles and the half holds him up. And then what follows is the emotional resonance. So, as such, although the poem's octet is clearly a highly idealised vision of a family, in the sense that the whole family is pulling together without any apparent conflict, which doesn't sound like mine, that same vision is also, it's highly idealised, but it's also quite practical in nature. The success of the pyramid is based at root on the ability of its human building blocks to provide one another with material, physical support, which sounds like I'm going to go pushing towards a really strongly Marxist analysis, but I'm not going to go any further with that. I'm just going to leave it there. Following sonnet conventions, of course, the poem's sestet rests on a sort of turn, formed in this instance out of the introduction of a new character, who the speaker calls my godson, Samuel Luke, but also formed out of what that character represents. And I shall read the concluding 6 lines of the poem now. Here he comes, my godson, Samuel Luke, passed up until he's standing in his nappy on my head. And now to why we're here. Could the Edwardses together reach a height that the youngest one of us could touch a star? Sam reaches out. He points towards the night. In a way that I think echoes the first part of the poem, the obvious emotional commitments that the poem depicts are just one part of the poem's sense of family. Specifically because a godson is indicative of an institutional relationship, as well as a signifier of shared affection. And as James White and David Klein's analysis of family life indicates, institutionally defined relationships are indeed a key element of families as social structures. However, there's always a however in analysis, the godson in this poem is not merely himself. He's also a symbol of a family's ambition. He is indicative of the whole point of the human pyramid itself. As the poem puts it, could the Edwardses together reach a height that the youngest one of us could touch a star? The point of the family's intertwining mutual support is what they might allow their youngest member to reach towards. Perhaps I can repeat that. The point of the family's intertwining mutual support is what they might allow their youngest member to reach towards. With the sestet carefully balancing the octet, this is not bound up here with anything material as such. Rather, in the final words of the poem, in which Samuel Luke points towards the night, what the physical structure of the pyramid is helping the family work towards is something far more intangible. I'm not going to tell you what that is, because I don't know. The point of the reaching out isn't made explicit, and I'm not really going to guess, but I think it's a gesture, rather than being something specific, that seems to point away from earthbound mundanities, indicative perhaps of some sort of hope or some sort of will towards transcendence. It's not clear. But I think, rather than focusing on what's being pointed towards, family in this poem seems to be what lifts you up, what points you at some far-off location, some far-off point to which you or those you love may hope to travel. A couple of points about style. Poetic language here is immediate, I think. It's directly accessible in terms of meaning and it's conversational in tone. And it has a carefully achieved sonnet structure which shapes the movement from foundational intertwining familial basis to the upwardness of hope. And I think both of those qualities render highly intelligible, really easy to feel, the sheer mutuality and hopefulness of what family is or what family constitutes for the speaker of this poem. Likewise, the poem's apparent freedom from both irony and scepticism stamp it with a striking heart-on-the-sleeve optimism. And the issue of to what extent this collection is free from irony and scepticism is an interesting one in its own right. But I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but it is something that I think is worth looking at in more detail. But the notion of heart-on-the-sleeve optimism in this poem can, I think, be easily dismissed as a sort of social naivety. A family in practice will never be as cohesive or conflict-free as the one in this poem. However, let me rescue it from that concept. I think that same quality, this same quality of heart-on-the-sleeveness, can equally be understood as an equivalent, a direct poetic equivalent to what Samuel Luke is reaching out towards at the end of the poem itself. Something beyond ourselves at which we point in hope. So the family in here, the idea of the family in here becomes something to which we, beyond ourselves, to which we can point in hope. And I think, to take my direction from Dave Morgan's review on Gwales.com, this is the construction of family within mythic terms. And I will just slide into a little slightly old-fashioned theory here, because what I mean to suggest is that family here becomes a key archetype of what the mid-20th century myth critic Northrop Frye understands as the comic mode of literature, a literary mode that Frye sees as rooted in community and as being expressed through, and I quote here from a work of 1951, images of symposium, communion, order, friendship and love. This was his notion of the comic mode of literature that was rooted in a sense of community and was expressed through images of symposium, communion, order, friendship and love. And family here in this poem, I would suggest then, is a key archetype of the comic mode of literature. So I've spent a long time on one poem, so I'll go on to the second poem in the book, nothing like dotting around from all over the place. I think that second poem echoes some of the perspectives that I've outlined as being important to the first. The gloriously titled Evel Knievel Jumps Over My Family is again a piece based on an outlandish construct. Here the notion of the whole Edwards family at Wembley Stadium being jumped over by the eponymous motorcycling stunt performer. The poem's first stanza immediately and absolutely explicitly emphasises the intergenerational quality of family for Edwards, as the poem's speaker describes how we Edwardses, 4 generations, stand in line between ramps. Just get the image into your head. But the end point of the poem isn't Evel Knievel's astonishing family flyover stunt, or the other pop culture references which so strikingly light up the poem's surface, more about which in a moment. Rather, after Evel Knievel has flown overhead, and after the speaker has wondered in a distinctly transcendental urge whether the daredevil stunt is, and I quote, what heaven feels like, what is left is this: all we Edwardses holding hands. That's from the final line, all we Edwardses holding hands. And note that holding hands. There's a physical connection there which is fundamental to the poem's sense of how family works together. In preparation for the lecture today, I have actually been listening to 80s movie theme songs in the car. So we have, and there are numerous pop culture references in Evel Knievel Jumps Over My Family. Monster Chucks are mentioned, Eye of the Tiger, which of course brings in all that stuff about Rocky, Liberace, Wembley Stadium, and of course Evel Knievel himself. I'm back in my youth. They're not the destination point of the poem, but they are nonetheless indicative of an important element within a number of Edwards's poems of family. Specifically, I want to suggest that he makes use of pop culture to provide the context for family interaction. Indeed, at points, pop culture even seems to provide a primary means by which family members are actually held together, or by which they try to hold themselves together. I think, if I'm right, the second poem on your handout is The Death of Doc Emmett Brown in Back to the Future. Yes, reassuring nods from the audience. I think that's a case in point with the eponymous 1985 Michael J. Fox movie providing a context for father-son interaction. And yes, I have listened to that Huey Lewis and the News song today. Specifically, the moment in the film, the context for the poem is the moment in the film in which Doc Brown is gunned down by terrorists. So the first two stanzas. I sit here in the darkness with my father, slurping Pepsi, passing popcorn round. The Libyans come fast around the corner. Pump Doc Brown with automatic fire. My feet are dangling inches from the ground. I sit here in the darkness with my father. You'll all spot the form straight away. Yes, a non-filler now, yes. But I think the form is very important to the ideas in the poem. Sometimes form just seems to be a kind of add-on, but I don't think it is here. I think it's integral to how the poem's thinking works. Because it's a poem in which the notion of returning moments is crucial. So it's a particularly apt form for a piece in which the speaker, having started with his childhood movie-watching experience with his own dad, ends up by watching the same movie with his own son. Actually, at the end of the poem, the speaker's father is still present and watching in this final moment of the poem, even if only in the form of a photograph on the wall. And again, may I reiterate, the motif of an older generation still being present is vitally important in Edwards' intergenerational sense of family. And the final stanza here offers up three generations of Edwardses bound together by one movie. I think it's very nicely done. There is, however, a slight ripple in the surface of family harmony here. Look at the final stanza. The speaker's son would rather be watching something else. My boy asks for Transformers instead. As from the wall his vamp looks down, I sit here in the darkness with my father. The Libyans come fast around the corner. Returns, in short, are not exact returns. Now, of course, the poem's speaker recognises this in his telling of the movie. For those of you who don't know, Doc Brown dies when he's first gunned down, but survives when the same incident happens again, having been warned of his fate by the time-travelling hero of the tale. But more importantly, I think, returns not being exact returns show up in the speaker's acknowledgement of changes in surrounding material economic circumstances. With his son, the speaker is watching the film at home on a DVD. With his father, however, he was in a cinema. As the penultimate stanza makes clear, perhaps reflecting what commentator Peter Coleman describes as, and I quote, the boom in building out-of-town shopping centres in the UK in the 1990s. So perhaps, as the penultimate stanza makes clear, the cinema has been, I quote, knocked down, moved out of town. In other words, the family may continue from generation to generation, but it does so amidst change, both in taste, the speaker's son wants a different movie, please, and in socio-cultural context. The cinema experience having been replaced, in this poem at least, by a DVD at home, the cinema having been knocked down, moved out of town. I'll just return to the family theorists James White and David Klein for a moment. They have noted that, and I quote, in most modern and well-developed societies, not quite sure what they mean by well-developed, families tend to have a private character, each one walled or fenced off from public view much of the time. I want to suggest, actually, that for the poetry of Jonathan Edwards, it seems to be equally important that family is, at times at least, very much on display, as it is most obviously, I suppose, in Evel Knievel Jumps Over My Family. In fact, even the seemingly private event of My Family in a Human Pyramid looks to me rather like a circus act, and thus appears distinctly as a performance of some sort. there has been some comment on the length of the titles of Jonathan's poems, and so we have a long titled poem here called, deep breath, Gregory Peck and Sophia Loren in Crumlin for the filming of Arabesque, June 1965. Breathe. Now, in that poem, it is precisely in a crowded social scene that we find the image of the speaker's mother-to-be. Family appears in a crowded scene, out in public. So, talking of his father, whose own tale of the event has him getting the Star's autographs that day, that's Gregory Peck and Sophia Loren, the poem's speaker asks us instead to look at, I quote, the photo of the crowd gathered that day he walked towards to share those autographs, his fame. There, front and middle, with her sister, the girl he hasn't met yet, there, my mother. The Edwards family, by which of course I mean the fictional construct within the poetry collection, the Edwards family may at times be extremely private. For example, the voice in which my mother read to me, that's the title of another of the poems, seems primarily to engage with an intimate element of a mother-son relationship, at least at its conclusion. However, and somewhat in contrast to notions of family as a primarily private unit, according to White and Klein, it's clearly vital to this particular poet that the family he constructs in his poetry is shown significantly in public spaces. So, I think for Edwards, family is manifestly a social structure that is also part of a larger, more public Welsh social sphere. So, for example, the Valleys crowd in Crumlin, in the poem I was just talking about, we see the women characterised by their chapel dresses. So there's the social construct. And it's within that context that the image of the mother appears. And there's a poem called Half Time, Wales versus Germany, Cardiff Arms Park, 1991. And that poem is about an important and memorable moment between father and son, but it happens in the context of a football crowd that surrounds father and son with their singing. It happens in a public space. The important private moment happens in a public space. So I think, to pull back those words of Northrop Frye that I quoted earlier, Edwards' sense of family at times opens out, importantly, into the broader sense of community, communion and symposium. The private space opens out into the more public space of community, which is my hook for going from family to community. One part of the lecture to another. I've been speaking for quite a while, about half an hour, so I've got to rattle on. So let me give you this contention, that beyond family, the sense of community, communion and symposium finds its particular work in Edwards's poems of locality. Substantially, South Wales Valleys and South East Wales post-industrial locality. The next poem on your handout, I think, is View of Valleys High Street through a cafe window. That's from early in the book's second section. And it's one of Edwards' poems of South Wales locality, as far as I read it. A poem which ostensibly offers a portrait of the Valleys High Street of the poem's title. However, the poem's approach to place is crucially to see place primarily in terms of people. Let me quote. Out there, this is the start of the poem, out there, policemen in attention-seeking fluoro vests eye up a single ma'am pushing a pram, her head down and her face so much a frown, it's like she's trying to mow the pavement. As the poem goes on, the ma'am and policeman are joined by a pair of lovers, a girl riding a bike while smoking, which gives rise to this image, this girl who smokes a fag and rides a bike past like a really crap steam train. Where was I going? Yes, and there's also a man who goes into a phone box looking for forgotten change. And then there's also the window reflections of the poet speaker himself and his unnamed companion or companions. The High Street, I want to suggest, is substantially seen in terms of the people, the human community, I suppose, who are in it at the moment of the poem's notional observation. And this is about as theoretical as I'm going to get this evening, because at this moment, Edwards's approach seems to suggest a notion of place that parallels what the geographer Doreen Massey, in her highly influential 2005 book For Space, calls, this isn't snappy, temporary constellations of trajectories. Temporary constellations of trajectories. In other words, in my less technical terms, the back and forth of any given point at any given moment. For the poem View of Valley's High Street, in other words, place is about, what place is these people in this road, in this weather, the poem notes the rain, at this time. For Doreen Massey, place is what she calls an event. It's not a static thing, it's an event. And there seems to be something of that, an important element of that, in Edwards's poem here too. Place is what is happening here and now, in the here and now of the poem's present tense. However, and wishing to show that poetry is not reducible to any given theoretical position, bugbear here, and that it is poor criticism which attempts to make it so, there, that's my manifesto for the evening. View of Valley's Village from a Hill, the companion poem to the one I'm just discussing, begins precisely with an image of the fixity of a place. I don't think I'll give you this one, I'll quote you the first few lines. From here you see how small it is, how narrow. Terraced houses gone square-eyed from looking too long at the homes opposite while people lug their lives to bus stop, chip shop, chapel. From here you see how small it is, how narrow. Terraced houses gone square-eyed from looking too long at the homes opposite while people lug their lives to bus stop, chip shop, chapel. I think here what we've got by comparison with the other poem is images of precisely the sort of linking together of landmarks by which the geographer Ifu Tuan understood place construction in his classic 1977 text, Space and Place. Here there is a terrace that's set enduringly opposite another, and there are people who are conducting their lives between established triangulation points of bus stop, chip shop, chapel. Edwards's valleys localities in these two poems may well be expressed primarily in terms of their people, who are, in this latter poem, literally carrying the weight of their lives from point to point. They're lugging their lives. But the non-human, material qualities of the places are never far away either. Indeed, in the perpetual present tense of the people who lug their lives to bus stop, chip shop, chapel, the people in this latter poem are given a sort of fixity too, in the sense of suggesting a perpetually settled social pattern that they're just moving between points. Edwards's approach to place is, as I said, huffily, not something I want to box up in the package of one particular theoretical notion of place or another. He seems to construct place poetically both as fixity and as shifting trajectories. But I do think his commitment, his poetic commitment to Welsh locality, and most obviously to a Valleys locality, is most clearly expressed in his interest in people, in human community. I mean, sort of that rather than built stuff. So I don't think that this is primarily actually a poetry of physical landmarks. Let me try and work on you with that one. There's a poem called Colliery Row, and in that poem the speaker is highly conscious of the street itself, the physicality of the street. There are landmarks that particular houses create and by which the poem itself navigates. So the poem travels from house number 5 in the first stanza to number 3, to number 6 in the second, to a property across the road, unspecified number, in stanza 3, to house number 3 by the end of stanza 4, and to both the other end of the row, again a quote, and number 8 by stanza 5. In other words, in the sense of, there's a crisscrossing, the poem gives you a sense of crisscrossing of lines from one physical point of the street to another, and I think it suggests the sort of geometric personality, I'm quoting from Ifu Tuan, that he attributes to a relatively fixed sense of space. So I've argued against myself there. But, however, there's always a however. I don't think that functions as an end in itself. But I think that's a construct within which the dramas of the street's people can take place. It's about the people. So there's the bus driver who may still be drunk in his morning shift. There's the man who is, and I quote, half naked at the first sign of sunshine. There are the skateboarding kids. There's the woman across the road, I quote, who's been walking around beneath a cloud of dark hair since she watched her husband go. What I'm going to suggest is that for Edwards, the place of the valleys, the place of his South Wales, is to a very great degree the conjunction of its people. What Doreen Massey calls, in an admirably suggestive coinage there, and this is all one word, thrown togetherness. Thrown togetherness, all one word. What is a street for? Asks the end of the poem in Colliery Row. Well, for Edwards, it seems to me to be very much about what he calls, in this poem, the semi-detached lives that the street brings into contact with one another. So I think it's unsurprising that character follows character in Edwards's poems of Welsh locality. The worker in a kebab shop and the woman who likes, or maybe stalks him, not quite worked out which it is, failed footballer Owen Jones, whose now reduced life is a progression from betting shop to kebab shop and back, just like the people actually who lug their lives, what's the quote, who lug their lives to bus stop, chip shop, chapel in view of Valleys village from a hill. There are the travellers in the poem 754 to Cardiff, who are temporarily thrown into community to the extent that the speaker knows that today is, quote, the third day since the girl who got on one day with a goldfish in a plastic bowl hasn't appeared. And where in that poem there's a supportive social interchange of, I quote, a bless you, borrowed tissue. Indeed, even the poem Chartist Mural, John Frost Square, Newport, which takes as its focus the eponymous 1978 mural by Kenneth Budd, which, to cite Rob Williams's words for The Independent, quote, commemorated the 1839 Chartist uprising in the city, and which was controversially destroyed by Newport Council in October 13, I think it was. Even this poem, which focuses so emphatically on a physical landmark, seemingly does so in order to construct a parade of characters. And this is the last poem over the page that I've given you. So variously, to cite a number of examples from the poem, quote, these men, flattened by history, quote, bottom right, these three forever dying, a, quote, school trip boy who stares, quote, king's men firing the slowest bullets in the world, and the tramp, as the poem calls him, at the end of the poem with his, quote, duvet growing from his chin. Precisely making all these people into a sort of symposium, to repeat that word of Northrop Frye's, which I'd given earlier, the resonant final line of the poem observes the way in which, and I quote, these bits and pieces men look at each other. The bits and pieces, in other words, of the mural itself and of so many lives. To make a bigger point from all this, and you can tell by my rhetoric and my speed that I'm slowing towards a finish, in Edwards's commitment to the many lives of so many different people, to whom we might add, for example, the eponymous character of the poem Girl, who, in Scarlet Heel's 6-inch, is the object of the speaker's possibly ironic affections, or the talk salesman who has, quote, all the flattery you can stand, or the Starbucks worker Rianne, quote, with her Minnie Mouse voice and her Popeye tattoos. In his commitment to all these people, in his poetic commitment to the value of their everyday lives, it seems to me that Edwards's poetic engagement with Newport's Chartist mural is of fundamental importance to this, his first book. And here's the point, and here's where I'm going to finish. Chartists. Edwards's poetry is an act of representation, I want to suggest, in the political sense. It is an act of commitment to the visibility of those people outside power on whose behalf Chartism itself was ostensibly advanced. Or to put it in another way, although in a form that I concede is a little abstract, Edwards's poems of locality, his poetry of locality, seems to me to be an attempt, itself Chartist-like, if you'll let me stretch the metaphor, to achieve a kind of suffrage for the communities that his poems both emerge out of and create. And on that highfalutin notion, I'll finish, and thank you for listening.